January 23, 1945, Iwo Jima, Volcano Islands, 0547 hours. The volcanic sand is black beneath their boots. It shifts and slides like ash from a funeral pyre, and the men of the 4th Marine Division feel it filling their socks, grinding against their skin, turning every step into a small act of endurance. The air tastes of sulfur and salt, a combination that coats the tongue and refuses to leave. In the pre-dawn darkness, the island is a silhouette against a sky that refuses to brighten, as if the sun itself hesitates to witness what will unfold here. Offshore, the battleships have gone quiet after hours of bombardment, and in that sudden silence the Marines can hear their own breathing, rapid and shallow, the sound of men preparing to meet something they cannot yet see. Private First Class Robert Dunlap crouches in a shell crater, his hands wrapped around a weapon that weighs 70 pounds when fully loaded. The M22 Flamethrower sits against his back like a grotesque hump, its twin fuel tanks pressing against his spine, the nozzle clutched in his gloved hands. Other Marines carry rifles, machine guns, mortars, weapons that make sense to the eye, that possess a certain martial elegance. Dunlap's weapon looks industrial, improvised, almost absurd. The tanks are cylindrical and clumsy, painted a dull green that does nothing to disguise their bulk. The ignition system protrudes from the nozzle assembly like an afterthought, a striker mechanism that seems too simple, too fragile for the violence it is meant to unleash. Somewhere in the darkness, in the honeycombed volcanic rock ahead, Japanese defenders wait in positions they have spent months perfecting. They have heard about the American flamethrower. Intelligence reports filtered down through the command structure of the Imperial Japanese Army have described it with a mixture of technical interest and barely concealed contempt. A weapon that shoots fire. A weapon that requires its operator to carry fuel on his back, to approach within meters of enemy positions, to expose himself completely while wielding it. To the soldiers of the Emperor, schooled in the way of the sword, trained to view death in combat as the highest honor, this American device seems less a weapon than a burden, a mechanical absurdity born of a nation that trusts machines more than spirit, that believes every problem can be solved with oil and steel rather than with courage and sacrifice. They do not yet understand what is coming toward them through the volcanic ash, crawling up the terraces of black sand toward their invisible fortifications. They do not yet know that the weapon they have dismissed will rewrite the calculus of infantry combat, will render obsolete every assumption about defensive warfare they have carefully cultivated. In the minutes before dawn, in the last moments before Private Dunlap receives the order to advance, the Japanese defenders are confident in their concrete and stone, in the overlapping fields of fire they have engineered, in the depth of their positions that descend like roots into the volcanic substrate of the island. They are wrong, but they do not know it yet. The flamethrower is not a new weapon. Ancient Greek fire, Byzantine siphons, medieval siege engines that hurled burning pitch. The desire to weaponize flame is as old as organized warfare itself. But the modern flamethrower, the portable, man-carried system that would define close combat in the 20th century, emerged from the industrial laboratories of Germany in the years before the First World War. The first functional models appeared in 1901, crude devices that paired pressurized gas with jellied fuel, and by 1911, the German army had adopted the Flammenwerfer as a specialized tool for clearing trenches and bunkers. When the Great War erupted across Europe in 1914, German assault troops carried these weapons into the mud of Flanders and the Somme, and the psychological effect was immediate and profound. Soldiers who could withstand artillery, who could endure machine gun fire with stoic determination, broke and ran when confronted with liquid fire that clung to skin and burned through cloth and flesh with indiscriminate hunger. The weapon was effective, but it was also hated. International discussions about banning flamethrowers began even before the Treaty of Versailles was signed, though such discussions produced little concrete action. The weapon occupied a strange moral territory, more visceral than high explosive, more personal than gas. It killed in a way that seemed to violate unspoken rules about how men should die in combat. After the First World War ended, most nations maintained small stockpiles of flamethrowers, but did not emphasize their development. They were niche weapons, tools for specialists, not standard infantry equipment. The assumption was that future wars would be mobile, mechanized affairs, where speed and firepower would dominate, where static defensive positions like the Western Front would be relics of a bygone era. The American military studied flamethrowers during the interwar period with the same bureaucratic thoroughness it applied to all weapons development, but without particular enthusiasm. The U.S. Army Chemical Warfare Service produced experimental models in the 1920s and 30s, testing various fuel mixtures and delivery systems, documenting results with meticulous care. But funding was limited, priorities lay elsewhere, and the flamethrower remained a curiosity, a weapon demonstrated at ordnance schools but rarely integrated into tactical doctrine. When American forces entered the Second World War in December 1941, the Standard Infantry Regiment possessed no flamethrowers at all. The weapon existed technically, but it existed in warehouses and testing ranges, not in the hands of combat troops.
Then came the Pacific. Then came Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, island fortresses where Japanese defenders transformed coral and volcanic rock into labyrinths of mutually supporting bunkers, pillboxes, and cave systems. The defensive architecture was sophisticated beyond anything American planners had anticipated. Positions were designed to be invisible from sea and air, camouflaged with native vegetation and volcanic ash, situated to create kill zones that channeled attackers into carefully prepared fields of fire. Concrete walls were thick enough to withstand naval bombardment. Entrances were angled to prevent direct fire from reaching the interior. Ventilation systems allowed defenders to survive for days without emerging. In these positions, Japanese soldiers waited with machine guns, mortars, and grenades, prepared to fight until the last man fell. Standard American infantry weapons proved inadequate against these fortifications. Rifle fire accomplished nothing against concrete. Artillery and naval gunfire could suppress positions temporarily, but rarely destroyed them. Satchel charges and TNT could collapse bunkers, but placing explosives required soldiers to approach within meters of enemy fire, and casualties were catastrophic. Marine and Army commanders found themselves in a desperate tactical dilemma: how to neutralize positions that were impervious to conventional firepower without suffering unacceptable losses in the process. The answer, when it finally crystallized, was fire. Portable, liquid fire delivered at close range by soldiers willing to carry the weight and accept the risk. The M1 flamethrower entered service in 1942, a weapon of compromises and hurried engineering. It was heavy, unreliable, and possessed a maximum range of only 45 feet. Operators complained that it leaked, that the ignition system failed in humid conditions, that the fuel mixture was inconsistent. But even in its imperfect state, the weapon proved devastatingly effective in the caves and bunkers of the Pacific. When flame entered a confined space, it consumed oxygen, created unbearable heat, and forced defenders to choose between burning or fleeing into the open where riflemen waited. The psychological effect was even more pronounced than the physical damage. Soldiers who could endure artillery and bombing broke when fire appeared at their bunker entrance, the primal fear of burning overriding training and discipline. By 1944, the U.S. military had refined the design. The M22 flamethrower that Private Dunlap would carry on to Iwo Jima was heavier than its predecessor, 70 pounds fully loaded, but far more capable. Its range extended to nearly 150 feet under ideal conditions. The fuel mixture, a jellied gasoline compound designated as napalm, clung to surfaces and burned longer than previous formulations. The ignition system, while still prone to occasional failures, was more reliable than the M1's crude striker mechanism. Most importantly, tactical doctrine had evolved. Flamethrower operators were no longer isolated specialists, but integrated members of infantry squads, supported by rifle teams and protected during their vulnerable approach to enemy positions. But the weapon's reputation preceded it. Japanese intelligence officers had documented American flamethrower use in previous campaigns, and their reports circulated through the command structure of the Imperial Japanese Army with a tone that mixed technical analysis with cultural dismissal. The weapon was described as typically American, mechanical, dependent on industrial production, requiring its operator to carry an enormous burden of equipment rather than relying on skill and spirit. It was seen as a weapon for a nation that could afford to waste resources, to expend fuel and machinery, rather than cultivating the fighting spirit that made individual soldiers formidable. Japanese defensive manuals acknowledged the effectiveness of the flamethrower against fixed positions, but expressed confidence that well-trained troops, fortified by proper morale and willing to accept death, could defeat or neutralize the weapon through discipline and sacrifice. This assessment was not entirely wrong. The flamethrower was a product of American industrial capacity, an embodiment of the material abundance that allowed the United States to equip its soldiers with specialized tools for every tactical challenge. Japanese forces, operating under severe resource constraints, could never field such weapons in comparable numbers. Their strategy relied on different principles: depth of fortification, willingness to fight from fixed positions to the death, and reliance on the superiority of Japanese martial spirit over American material wealth. In the abstract, this was a coherent military philosophy. In practice, against an enemy willing to match firepower with determination, it would prove tragically insufficient. Private Dunlap does not think about military philosophy as he waits in the volcanic sand. He thinks about the weight on his back, about the men beside him who will cover his approach, about the bunker entrance somewhere ahead that he's been ordered to neutralize. He has carried the flamethrower for 3 months, since Saipan, and the weapon has become familiar in the way that all carried burdens become familiar. Not comfortable, never comfortable, but known. He knows how the fuel sloshes in the tanks when he moves, how the nozzle grows hot after sustained firing, how the weapon's balance shifts as the tank's empty. He knows the smell of the napalm, a sharp chemical odor that clings to clothes and skin. He knows the sound the weapon makes when it fires, a roar like a furnace opening, followed by the strange silence where men's screams should be, but often are not, because flame kills faster than sound can carry. The order comes as dawn begins to break, a gray light that does nothing to warm the volcanic landscape. The Marines advance in short rushes, squad by squad, using shell craters for cover, rifles ready, eyes scanning the terraced slopes ahead for movement. The Japanese positions remain invisible until the first machine gun opens fire, muzzle flashes winking from what appears to be solid rock. Marines drop, seeking cover, returning fire at shadows and stone. The machine gun continues firing short, disciplined bursts, conserving ammunition, revealing nothing of the bunker's exact location except the general direction of its killing zone.
Dunlap's squad leader points toward the source of fire, and Dunlap nods, understanding without words. He begins crawling forward, the flamethrower tanks scraping against volcanic rock, the nozzle held close to his body. 2 Marines move with him, providing covering fire, shooting at the hillside to keep Japanese heads down. The distance closes slowly. 100 yards, 80, 60. The machine gun swivels, searching for new targets, its rounds kicking up black sand in geysers. 40 yards. Dunlap can see the bunker entrance now, a rectangular shadow in the volcanic slope, reinforced with coconut logs and sandbags, designed to be nearly invisible until you were close enough to die. At 30 yards, Dunlap rises to a crouch and triggers the weapon. The striker mechanism sparks, the pressurized fuel ignites, and a stream of fire arcs across the volcanic slope like a liquid comet. The flame is not the clean orange of a campfire or the yellow of a candle. It is darker, uglier, a mixture of black smoke and red heat that seems to crawl rather than flow. The stream reaches the bunker entrance and pours inside, disappearing into the rectangular shadow, and for a moment, nothing happens. Then the machine gun goes silent. No explosion, no dramatic secondary detonation, just silence where there had been firing, just the absence of threat where there had been mortal danger seconds before. Dunlap fires again,
hosing the entrance, ensuring saturation, watching the flames splash against concrete and logs. The napalm clings where it lands, burning with steady intensity, consuming oxygen, raising the temperature inside the bunker to levels incompatible with human life. Still no sound from within, no screams, no return fire, nothing. Other Marines advance past Dunlap's position, rifles ready, prepared for Japanese soldiers to emerge burning or desperate. None do. When engineers finally approach the bunker entrance, hours later, after the fire has burned itself out, they find 8 bodies inside, positioned at firing ports and ammunition stores, dead from heat and asphyxiation, their weapons unfired, their defenses rendered irrelevant by a weapon they had dismissed as an industrial toy.
American forces, for their part, experienced the flamethrower's effectiveness with a mixture of relief and horror. Relief, because it worked, because positions that would have cost dozens or hundreds of casualties to take with conventional assault could be neutralized by a single operator with a flamethrower. Horror, because using the weapon was intimate in a way that rifle fire or artillery was not. Flamethrower operators saw what their weapon did at ranges measured in feet, not yards. They heard the sounds from bunkers when fire entered, saw the smoke that emerged, smelled the aftermath. Some operators requested transfers after extended combat. Others became coldly efficient, viewing the weapon as a tool and the killing as necessary work. All of them carried the weight, literal and psychological, of being the men who burned other men alive, even when those other men were enemy soldiers in fortified positions who would have killed any American who approached within range. The ethical questions about flamethrowers had been debated before, during the interwar period, in the halls of military academies and international conferences. But on Iwo Jima, those questions became moot. The weapon worked, it saved American lives by taking Japanese lives more efficiently than alternatives, and in the calculus of combat operations, that was sufficient justification. Moral qualms were luxuries for peacetime. On volcanic islands where every yard of advance cost blood, the flamethrower was not a moral question, it was a tactical necessity. There is a photograph taken on Iwo Jima, February 1945, that never achieved the fame of the flag raising on Mount Suribachi, but which tells its own story about the nature of the Pacific War. The photograph shows a Marine flamethrower operator, his weapon clearly visible on his back, standing beside a Japanese bunker entrance. The entrance is blackened with soot, the concrete scorched, and from within the structure, smoke still rises in thin wisps. The operator's face is partially obscured by his helmet, but his posture is one of exhaustion, not triumph. He stands with shoulders slumped, the nozzle of the flamethrower pointed at the ground, looking at the bunker entrance with an expression the camera cannot fully capture, but which seems to contain neither satisfaction nor remorse, simply the blank weariness of someone who has done terrible work and knows he will do it again tomorrow. This photograph circulated through military publications after the battle, usually accompanied by captions emphasizing American tactical superiority and the effectiveness of specialized weapons. But the image contains more than tactical demonstration. It is a portrait of a specific kind of warfare, one where victory is measured not in dramatic charges or strategic maneuvers, but in the systematic reduction of fortified positions, bunker by bunker, cave by cave, through the application of overwhelming material force. The operator in the photograph is not a hero in the traditional sense. No moment of individual valor is captured here, no dramatic action. He is an instrument of industrial warfare, a man made dangerous not by personal martial skill, but by the weapon his nation's factories produced and his supply lines delivered to him across thousands of miles of ocean. Japanese observers, when they later studied the American campaign on Iwo Jima, focused extensively on the flamethrower's role in breaking their defensive positions. Post-war military analyses, written by former Imperial Army officers, returned again and again to the same conclusion.
The tactical problem of the flamethrower had no adequate solution within the resource constraints and strategic framework Japan operated under. Countermeasures existed in theory, longer-range defensive fire to kill operators before they closed to flamethrower range, sally ports to allow counterattacks against exposed operators, better compartmentalization of bunker systems to limit flame penetration. But all these countermeasures required resources Japan no longer possessed: more ammunition to sustain suppressive fire, more troops to conduct counterattacks, more steel and concrete to build more sophisticated fortifications. The defensive strategy on Iwo Jima and subsequent island battles was not chosen because it was optimal, but because it was all that remained available to a nation being systematically outproduced and outsupplied by an enemy whose industrial base dwarfed its own. The flamethrower, in this context, was more than a weapon. It was a symbol of the fundamental asymmetry that defined the Pacific War. Japan fought with what it had: courage, discipline, tactical sophistication, willingness to die. America fought with what it could make: ships, planes, tanks, specialized weapons for every tactical situation, and the logistics network to deliver all of it to the front lines. Neither approach was morally superior. Both were expressions of their respective national capacities and strategic circumstances. But one approach was winning, and the other was drowning in fire. Private Dunlap survives Iwo Jima. He returns to the United States in late 1945, after Japan surrenders. And the flamethrower he carried for 8 months of combat is turned into a military depot, cleaned, cataloged, and placed in storage. He does not speak much about the weapon, about what it was like to use it, about the bunkers that fell silent after he fired. When asked years later by his grandchildren what the war was like, he tells stories about his friends, about the volcanic sand that got into everything, about the flag on Suribachi that he saw from his position on the beach. He does not tell them about the flamethrower. Some memories are not for sharing, not because they are too painful, but because they exist in a realm beyond easy description, where the work done was necessary but not noble, where survival and victory came through methods that resist comfortable narrative.
The M22 flamethrower remains in U.S. military service through Korea and into the early years of Vietnam. Each conflict produces its own grim statistics of effectiveness: bunkers neutralized, tunnels cleared, positions overrun. The weapon evolves, becomes lighter, more reliable, longer ranged, but it also becomes controversial in ways it never was during World War II. Public opinion shifts. Images of burning villages appear on television screens, and the flamethrower transforms from tactical tool to symbol of excessive force, of American military power unrestrained by proportion or mercy. The weapon that saved countless American lives by burning enemy soldiers in fortified positions becomes emblematic of everything critics find objectionable about American military conduct. The ethical questions that were set aside during the fight against Imperial Japan resurface in the context of counterinsurgency and limited war. By the late 1970s, the flamethrower is phased out of U.S. military service, not because it ceased to be effective. The tactical situations where flame weapons excel still occur, but because the weapon has become politically and symbolically untenable. International protocols restrict incendiary weapons against civilian populations. Public perception has shifted, and newer weapons, like thermobaric explosives, can accomplish similar tactical goals with less visceral imagery. The flamethrower becomes a museum piece, a relic of a particular era of warfare, studied by military historians and viewed by veterans with complicated feelings that resist simple categorization. In Japan, the memory of the flamethrower occupies its own complex space. It appears in accounts of the island battles, in memoirs of survivors, in historical studies of the Pacific War's final campaigns. It is described with the same technical precision Japanese military writers bring to all weaponry. But underlying that precision is an acknowledgement of what the weapon represented, the material superiority that Japan could not match, the tactical problem it could not solve, the physical manifestation of why fighting spirit, however genuine, proved insufficient against an enemy that could bring to bear such overwhelming resources. The soldiers who faced flamethrowers and died in their bunkers are honored as patriots who fought with the utmost courage in impossible circumstances. The weapon that killed them was remembered as emblematic of the industrial and logistical dominance that made Japan's defeat inevitable. There is a truth about warfare that resists comfortable ideology but persists across centuries of conflict. Wars are won not by the side with the purest motives or the strongest will, but by the side that can bring more effective force to bear at decisive points. Courage matters, strategy matters, leadership matters, but all of these operate within the framework of material reality. A fortified position, however bravely defended, falls when sufficient force is applied against it. A determined defense, however willing to fight to the last man, collapses when the enemy possesses weapons against which no adequate defense exists. The story of the flamethrower on Iwo Jima is often told as a tale of American ingenuity and tactical innovation, and that telling is not wrong. The weapon was effective, its integration into infantry tactics was sophisticated, and its deployment saved American lives by providing a solution to a genuine tactical problem. But the story is also about something less comfortable to acknowledge: the overwhelming material advantage that allowed America to field specialized weapons for every tactical challenge, to equip soldiers with 70 pounds of flamethrower fuel because the logistics system could deliver it, to approach warfare as an engineering problem rather than a test of spirit. Japanese defenders on Iwo Jima mocked the flamethrower before they faced it, viewing it as evidence of American mechanical dependence and lack of warrior spirit. They were not entirely wrong in their cultural analysis. American military culture did emphasize technological solutions over individual martial prowess, did trust machinery over intangible qualities like fighting spirit. But their mockery was born of misunderstanding what that mechanical approach represented. It was not weakness or spiritual deficiency. It was a different theory of warfare, one that had emerged from different historical circumstances and national characteristics. America fought its wars with the tools of industrial democracy: mass production, logistical sophistication, the systematic application of material resources to tactical problems. This approach lacked the aesthetic appeal of warrior cultures, possessed none of the romantic mythology of individual combat, but it won battles and wars with brutal efficiency. The flamethrower that turned Japanese strongholds silent in seconds was not ultimately a story about a single weapon. It was a story about two incompatible visions of warfare meeting on volcanic islands, about what happens when fighting spirit confronts industrial capacity, about how modern war had evolved into something that transcended individual courage and had become, for better or worse, a contest of production and logistics. The Japanese defenders who died in their bunkers were not cowards. They fought with extraordinary determination against an enemy whose material advantages made victory impossible. The American soldiers who carried flamethrowers were not sadists. They used the weapons they were given to accomplish the missions they were assigned in a war where failure meant a longer conflict and more deaths. When the last shot was fired on Iwo Jima, when the island was secured and the casualty lists compiled, the flamethrowers stood as a monument to a particular kind of warfare. It was a weapon that could only exist in an army supplied by an industrial nation, wielded by soldiers who trusted machinery because their nation manufactured trustworthy machinery, effective precisely because it represented an approach to combat that prioritized results over aesthetics, survival over honor, pragmatic effectiveness over warrior ideals. It was a weapon of democracy, not because democracies are inherently more humane, the flamethrower's effects were anything but humane, but because democracies, particularly one as industrially powerful as mid-century America, waged war through material abundance rather than spiritual exhortation.
The volcanic sand of Iwo Jima is still black, still shifts beneath the feet of visitors who come to see where the battle was fought. The bunkers remain, many of them, concrete structures too solid to fully demolish, their entrances still blackened with soot that 70 years have not entirely erased. Tourists walk the landing beaches, visit the memorial, photograph the monument to the flag raising. Few visit the bunkers in the interior, the tunnels and caves where the flamethrower did its work. Those places are not scenic, contain no uplifting narratives, speak to something about warfare that resists the commemorative impulse. But the bunkers tell their story to those willing to listen. They speak of men who built defensive positions with extraordinary skill and determination, who waited in darkness for an enemy they knew possessed overwhelming advantages, who fought until fire consumed them because surrender was not in their vocabulary. They speak equally of men who carried 70 pounds of fuel on their backs, who walked toward machine gun fire to close within range, who pulled triggers knowing exactly what their weapon would do to the humans on the other side of concrete walls. Both groups were brave, both groups did their duty as they understood it, and both groups participated in a form of warfare that had moved beyond individual virtue and into the realm of industrial process. The flamethrower they mocked did not win through being a superior weapon in some abstract sense. It won because it was the right weapon for a specific tactical problem, wielded by an army that possessed the resources to field it in sufficient numbers and the tactical doctrine to employ it effectively. It won because the nation that produced it could afford to manufacture specialized equipment for specialized tasks, could deliver that equipment across an ocean, could train soldiers in its use and integrate them into combined arms operations. It won, ultimately, because it represented an approach to warfare that Japan, with its limited resources and different military culture, could not match or counter. This is the truth the blackened bunkers of Iwo Jima preserve, that modern warfare is decided less by courage or tactics than by industrial capacity and logistical sustainability. That fighting spirit, however genuine and deeply instilled, cannot overcome material disadvantage of sufficient magnitude. That the army which brings more effective tools to the battlefield, supported by more robust supply lines and more sophisticated industrial production, will prevail regardless of the spiritual quality of its opponents. It is not an ennobling truth, not one that fits comfortably into narratives of heroism and virtue, but it is truth, nonetheless, written in volcanic ash and concrete, in the silence that follows when flame enters a fortified position and renders courage irrelevant through the simple application of overwhelming force. The soldiers who fought on Iwo Jima, on both sides, deserve to be remembered as men who did what their nations asked of them in circumstances almost unimaginably difficult. But they also deserve to be understood as participants in a larger story about how warfare evolved in the 20th century, about what happens when industrial democracies mobilize their full productive capacity, about the kinds of weapons that emerge from such mobilization and what those weapons reveal about the societies that create them. The flamethrower was one such weapon, as American as mass production and assembly lines, as democratic as the belief that every problem has a material solution, as devastating as the industrial capacity that could deliver fire in portable form to volcanic islands 7,000 miles from home. They mocked it until it spoke. And when it spoke, in a voice of flame and silence, it told a story about abundance and engineering, about logistics and industry,
about a nation that waged war not with samurai spirit, but with factories and supply ships and specialized weapons for every conceivable tactical need. It was not a beautiful story, not one to inspire poetry or honor codes, but it was the story of how the Pacific War was won, bunker by bunker, stronghold by stronghold, through the systematic application of flame against stone, of industrial power against fortified determination, of material abundance against scarcity and will. The flamethrower they dismissed as a toy burned through their defenses in seconds, and in doing so demonstrated a fundamental truth about mid-century warfare that all the fighting spirit in the world could not alter or overcome.